Hello, it's an absolute privilege to be introducing our first ZOUD podcast. ZOUD stands for Zone of Uncomfortable Debate. And it's where we're creating a space and enabling a voice and liberating speech around some of those difficult, complex and sensitive topics that organizations and people are finding difficult to address, especially in the workplace. It's about really demonstrating, as I believe, we can have any conversation and leave people whole. And that's part of what I specialize in, really facilitating those difficult conversations. Well, joining me on this maiden voyage are two amazing people who were willing to say yes. They were very gracious in saying yes. My first guest was Roger Kline, who is Research Fellow at Middlesex University Business School. Roger is rapidly becoming a household name. Most people would know of him through research papers such as No More Tick Boxes, Fair to Refer, and also Snowy White Peaks. So it was amazing to have him on. And then my other guest was Dr. Kathleen Hamblin, who is a certified diversity executive. She's also a keynote speaker. She is a global consultant with over 25 years of experiences in building up boards and leadership coaching. And in actual fact, Kathleen was my trainer at the Institute for Diversity Certification, where I achieved my certification. So I thought it'd be really nice to bring her on and to hear some of those broader trends that is playing out across the diversity industry. Well, in this first session, we were exploring the topic DEI or die. What is going on with the diversity agenda? What is going on with all of the initiatives and the programs and the strategies? Why does it feel as if we're grinding to a halt? They say perception is more powerful than the truth, and that's what we're going to explore in this podcast. Well, before we went into the topic, I asked them to choose a word that they would use to describe the current DEI landscape, and they were to tell me why. Let's take a look at what they said.
I think probably it's uncertainty. And the reason I say that is because there are a number of tensions. There's so much to do, but progress is too slow. There's a lot more good intention, I think, certainly in the UK than there used to be. But there's a lot of performative activity. After George Floyd and Me Too, there was a greater understanding that something had to be done, but no real clarity about what might be done that would make the difference that people wanted to make. And I think underneath all that, there was still this sense that it was for those who are disadvantaged to lead the charge on disadvantage, rather than those of us who have power and privilege to see it as our responsibility to take that on. And I think that's been very frustrating for a lot of people.
Okay, so my one word is a word I've never used before in conversation, but it's inchoate. So inchoate meaning just emerging in an early stage of development. So in a way, we could say that diversity has been around since, well, forever, but a focus on diversity and people talking about diversity issues has been around since maybe the 60s and the civil rights movement. But I really think that it's gone through a lot of different stages and growing pains. And to me, it seems like now it is really beginning to emerge with substance. I think for a long time, there wasn't really an understanding of, diversity, so we need to have an event or we need to value differences, but there wasn't the understanding of the importance of inclusion or then the tremendous importance of equity. And so now some of the important pieces are coming into place to begin to activate diversity and get the benefits from diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow, those are some powerful words and reflections. And I liked what Roger said about slow progress and a lot of the effort and focus being on performative activity. I thought it was also interesting when he referred to the George Floyd murder and also the Me Too movement, because we know that a lot of the DEI acceleration, the investment, the focus on this activity was all brought about through this social unrest. But now that that's sort of calming down, we know that people are still looking for what is it that DEI, diversity efforts, are supposed to be achieving in the workplace. And I think that a lot of people are at that stage kind of asking what next. And then I liked what Catherine said, a new word, inchoate. Actually, I had to look it up on the internet because I'd never heard that before. But inchoate meaning just emerging. Yes, I agree. There are lots of best practices emerging, lots of new initiatives and lots of new focuses. One of them that I like personally is the diversity business case, which you'll hear about later on in this podcast. But as I was listening to both Roger and Kathleen, it started to get me thinking about what might be some of the issues. And so I asked them a little bit about their thoughts on diversity fatigue. Let's hear what they said.
I just think that in that history that has happened within the field, there have definitely been mistakes that have been made, and people have formed associations between bringing in increased diversity and lowering standards, or the overpromise of the business case. If you have more diversity, you'll automatically have more innovation and better performance and better financial performance, and just so many mistakes that have been made along that journey. And mistaking, this is already getting into sort of the next question, but mistaking action for impact and running around doing all these activities and too many things and not delivering on anything. And yes, absolutely, you can have diversity fatigue as a big problem.
I think that that's probably where the fatigue is happening, because we're still not seeing that diversity at the top, and we're hearing a lot of commitments, but I don't believe that we're really seeing that change. I'm really feeling, I think, frustrated that we're getting a lot of lip service, but organizations are still not getting the core of this is important. They're doing a lot of lip service.
So I think I agree with Kathleen in this sense. So in the health service, which is where I primarily work, it's the biggest employer in the UK, 1.4 million workers. What I sense when I go into boards is I get a lot less, almost nobody asking, why is this important? Why should we be doing it? Which used to happen quite a lot. It's much more now about how. But there is, and I would agree with Kathy, there's this sense that there must be some quick fix, some silver bullets somewhere. There are no silver bullets in this. Take time, but it doesn't help if you are doing things almost for the sake of looking as if you're doing something, rather than thinking through what are the things that research and best practice suggests are like to have more impact. I find that quite frustrating, but we have moved away to a significant degree, certainly in the health service, from what I used to call the avoidance and denial that there was a problem. And now, okay, we have a problem. What are we going to do about it? But I agree with Kathleen, there are some issues about people have some fairly daft ideas about what the evidence is. And if that gets challenged, it can actually put you really on the back foot.
Yes, there were some really poignant points there, and I really like the acknowledgement of mistakes being made. As Kathleen said, we have made a lot of mistakes, but I also think it's about looking at it as learning experiences. We wanted to do something had to start, and I was, and still am, a big believer in getting a movement going and driving awareness, but then what next? And I like the point that she made about over-promising, which led into Roger's point about the quick fix. That I like the point where he said there are no silver bullets. And that's the challenge that we have with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, that everyone thinks, or there's this tendency to think that it's got to happen overnight. How long does it take for somebody to change? How long does it take for someone to get on board? How long does it take senior leaders to really put this at the forefront so that it's even on par with operations and finance and all the other compliant areas we have within organizations? And the question is, how long is a piece of string? So I think that is something that we need to really think about, that there has to be this sustainability, this longevity when we are building our diversity, equity and inclusion strategies, so that they're not seen as programs that have a start time and an end time, but they're evolving as part of the business. So that conversation was quite rich, and that led into Dr. Kathleen, or she told me to call her Kathleen. She started talking about the inclusion of white men, and this is looking at some of the mistakes that were made. And we do know that there was this famous saying, white male and stale, and people feeling that they couldn't be a part of diversity because we made it so much about race. Well, I find it really interesting, the discussion that they had on including everyone. Let's take a look.
Fine line between challenging people and teasing them off. There is no merit whatsoever in making people feel guilty. But there is merit in making people, challenging people about their roles, their responsibilities, trying to get them to put themselves in other people's shoes, listen carefully and with attention to the lived experience of people they work with or people that they manage, because the evidence suggests that putting yourself in people's shoes and trying to listen in that way, but being challenged, in the UK it will be about trying to understand how is it that race is such a delicate issue to talk about, but then you have to go beyond that, and you have to be able to say, if we do these things, first of all, understand what are the problems in this particular workplace. What's the data say? If we're looking at finance, we expect to have data. If we're looking at quality of care, we expect to have data. Somehow or other, we think we can survive without data on EDI. I mean, quite granular, difficult data that looks at the relative likelihood, for example, of people entering disciplinary processes, of being appointed from shortlisting and so on. So we need the data. And then we need to understand it, and in a way I'm following Kathleen. We have relied upon policies, procedures and training, largely in isolation, changing culture and improving outcomes. I'm not saying we don't need policies, procedures and training, but research is really clear that in isolation, they will not make the difference we want to make. So as well as trying to talk with people about diversity, we need to de-bias processes.
I hear you, Roger. Really impactful, really authentic. I loved his reflection on including everyone. Now, a little bit later, we're going to hear Kathleen's view on including white male. But I liked what Roger said. Roger said that, when we're holding people to account, it's not about making people feel guilty. And I've certainly had conversations with colleagues and people who say, I'm really trying to just understand this a little bit more. But I feel that if I'm not overtly sort of championing this on, and if I have questions that I'm made to feel as if I'm doing something wrong, well, that's not the intention of the diversity movement. It's not supposed to make people feel guilty, but it's what Roger says. It's about behavioral nudges, that tap on the shoulder, that kind of conversation that is said with respect and with good intentions so that we can hold each other to account. I think he also made a really great point on the criticality of data. Of course, data is important. And for years, we have been battling with getting that real, rich and solid data to support DEI efforts. And I mean, it's still a big problem today. And I read something a few months ago from an NHS paper that said, listen, we've been talking about data to death. Actually, we have the data. what next? What is it that we need to be doing with this data? And again, I think this is the next step that most DEI professionals and organizations are looking to do. Don't forget, this is about removing systemic barriers, creating real inclusive cultures where everyone is welcomed and everyone feels a sense of personal belonging. Well, if we can't talk about data and prioritize where we focus our energies, then we're going to be stuck. And this point that he made about policies and procedures and training alone will not do it. I totally agree with it. It's that performative activity. If I'm doing something, then at least it looks like I'm doing something. But to what effect is that doing something having on this organizational change that we're trying to achieve? So I really, really love that. Well, we're now going to be going into our next question, and I asked them a specific question about what were some of the issues that they were seeing playing out in the workplace. Let's hear what they had to say.
Discuss. So this issue of white males especially feeling uncomfortable to even discuss this issue, feeling like they're being blamed, like they're under threat because something's going to be taken away from them. Who wants to yes, vulnerability and courage is wonderful in leadership, but who really wants to put themselves in a position where they might be publicly humiliated, embarrassed, say the wrong thing, offend somebody, maybe cause a lawsuit? So people play it safe by avoiding giving developmental feedback to people who are different from themselves, by just, shying away from the whole thing, by seeing DEI as not something that has anything to do with me. But how is any movement how is any initiative or any efforts in an organization going to succeed if you are alienating a large part of the workforce and many of the people, or most of the people who have the power in the organization? So I think one thing we need to do is start realizing that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not about excluding people. It's about including people. And everybody has something to contribute to this. And white males also have diverse elements of identity within their own personality and their own social identity. So this is something that's really for everybody. Some of the mistakes that I see organizations falling into are just winging it. Okay, I hear there's diversity, equity, and inclusion going on, and we should do something about that too. So, let's just have some kind of unconscious bias workshop. And I get requests for, can you do a half-hour talk about unconscious bias? Why? Why are you doing this? Because you heard other people are doing this, or you should be doing something. So there's this mistaking activity or actions for impact. There's this winging it or jumping into it without really knowing what are the issues that we're trying to address, what are the actual pain points, what are the organizational goals, how can we approach this in a strategic way? Not having your actions or your initiatives in any way tied to the organizational strategy, to the bottom line, to the organizational goals. So those are some, putting a focus on just training. We'll do some little 1 hour thing on unconscious bias, and that's going to fix everything. As Roger, I understand, with his tick the boxes, thing, we'll just hire, 5 more women for the middle level of management. By the way, when we talk about hiring women, we're usually talking about the default group, white women, so we'll bring in 5 white women to the middle level of management, and then all of our problems will be fixed, even though we don't have an inclusive culture and there's no equity. So they're going to be treated horribly once they're here. We'll try and pressure them to be just like the people that we already have. So we hire you for diverse elements, but then we want you to behave just like the people we have.
So I think the first thing, and it was very dominant in the NHS, the health service in England, for a long time, was what Mary Dixon Watts calls comfort seeking rather than problem sensing. There was a sort of denial that things were as bad as particularly those who were disadvantaged said they were. The lived experience was discounted. I think that's changed, but that was a big problem, and it still to some degree happens. The second one is the difficulty that many white people have in having honest conversations with black and minority ethnic colleagues. there's this nervousness about saying the wrong thing, about looking as if you are a racist or a sexist. And that really gets in the way of, in very practical ways, of things like appraisals, feedback from interviews, whether you refer someone to a disciplinary investigation. And the third and final thing is a misunderstanding about what sorts of things, what model, what methodology is more likely to be successful in changing discrimination. And the one we currently use is pretty fundamentally flawed, according to the research.
I'm pretty sure that most of you that are watching are probably ticking off some of the issues that Kathleen and Roger outlined in that question. Really interesting points. I could hear the passion from Kathleen around including white male. Now, we know that this was a fundamental mistake that was made in that first generation when we were all getting started. Maybe you don't feel that that was a mistake. So if you've got a view on that, why don't you pop something in the chat, share your feedback about what you think about the intentional inclusion of white men in diversity, because it's not about excluding anyone, it's about including everyone. So that's a really interesting point that she made. And she said, the impact of not being able to really get fully on board with diversity is that it plays out practically, not giving feedback, not feeling able to really address issues, especially if there's someone different to themselves, because for fear of being branded in a way that is negative. So I thought that was really good. And also I loved what Roger said about comfort seeking, and the fact that, many times the lived experiences of people, especially those from underrepresented groups, was kind of minimalized. It didn't really matter, or people didn't really have that empathy to say that this experience that I'm going through is really impacting me. It was kind of dismissed as something that, probably wasn't as intense as it should be. And then he just went straight for it, didn't he? The difficulties that white people have with engaging with BME colleagues. And yet still, we know that race is probably the most sensitive, the most uncomfortable, the most difficult to really address when it comes to implementing diversity in the workplace. It really is it's a hotbed, as I would say. It is a difficult topic. And then I like that Roger was talking about what are some of the best measures and methods for truly driving that systemic change. I love the fact we've talked about equality, but we know that equality is something that is part of it, but it's not the totality, because we're not all equal. We're not all at the same level playing field. And so therefore, equality needs to give way to equity, which is the fair distribution of resources, opportunities, etc., etc. So that's, I think we're going to hear more of the equity as well as equality. And it's about removing those systemic barriers, those things that support and enable discrimination in the workplace. And by the way, I'm not just talking about race, I'm talking about gender, I'm talking about age, I'm talking about disabilities, I'm talking about all the other things that tend to get clouded out with race. So I think this is really good. And so then when we were talking about the issues in the workplace, I then asked them about the diversity business case. And it's probably not a terminology that's common in the UK, but I did some training on it. And I think we would call it I don't know, like, why do you want to do this? So you put your business proposal forward for something new that you want to introduce into the organization. And we know that just recently in the news, there's been a lot of focus on, how much money is being spent on diversity efforts. And so people are now calling for some more justification. I'm in total agreement with this. I really, really do believe that DEI practitioners need to be able to justify whatever we are doing as part of the strategy. We do that if we want for finance, we do that for HR, and I don't think DEI should be an exception. We need to be able to justify and have really good and informed discussions and decisions about why we want to implement something and what is the benefit to the organization and what is the benefit to employees as well. And we know, against the backdrop of all of that, that a lot of these things take time, and time is not always on our side when it comes to diversity.
So I think if I look at the health service, the business case, if I can call it that, for diversity and inclusion in the health service is not primarily around saving money. Indirectly, it does save lots of money. It's about, if you have diverse teams underpinned by inclusion, so they work in a kind of context of psychological safety, they will deliver safer care, they will collaborate better, they will communicate better. And there's a very strong evidence base around that. But it's not about somehow or other, if you employ more women or more BME colleagues or more staff with disabilities, somehow magically you save money. In practice, you do. So, for example, in the health service, we have very sharp staff shortages, disproportionate number of women and BME colleagues are leaving the health service. 1 in 9 nurses left the NHS last year, 1 in 9 nurses. And when you look at who's then surfaced on the bank and working for agency, they are disproportionately female and BME staff. Female staff because organisations were unable to provide flexible working arrangements. BME staff because of their treatment, bullying, harassment, undermining. So you do save a lot of money by sort of slowing down that exit. And within, there's lots of research now, within psychologically safe, inclusive teams, turnover is lower, staff engagement is greater. There's a lot, you can actually put a number on it, but if you look for short-term financial benefits from it, you're going to be really disappointed. And I think somehow or other, post-Me Too, post-George Floyd, people were looking for quick results. There are no quick results in this field.
And you can get the exact opposite of what you want. So by bringing in more diversity, you can actually end up with more conflict, more people leaving, more turnover, and really bad brand ambassadors going all over the place saying, oh, that place is horrible. And also undermining diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, because I know one organization that put so much money and effort into hiring a lot of female middle-level managers, and they were so competent and so motivated and came in, and 1 year later, 60% of them had left, reporting feeling crushed by the culture. So that doesn't help either side, anybody, So I think this is the problem when people just are jumping in and trying to do something, but without really understanding what they need to do.
So the last clip that I'm going to show you is around accountability. I asked them, with all of these issues happening, who do they hold accountable? Who should we be really focusing on? Who should we be building great relationships with? Who should we be pulling closer into the DEI world so that we get some traction? Now, here's what they said.
So 2 things. In the UK, EDI roles are relatively junior. There's not a very clear career structure. So what tends to happen is the board says, we're going to do this, that, and the other, and then they give it to a relatively junior person to lead who doesn't really have authority. In the NHS, the organisations that are making most progress are the ones where the chief executive puts him or herself out front. If I may give a couple of examples. So one very large hospital in London, the chief executive, on top of a whole range of other things, they've got a dashboard, will randomly ring up senior people who've been running interview panels and say, I've looked at your recent appointments. Quite a disproportionate number of them are men or are white. Could we talk through why you think that's happening and what the organisation can do to help you change that? So it's not a beating you up conversation, but you can imagine nobody wants 2 phone calls from the chief executive about the same thing. So it's a kind of very effective bias interrupter or behavioral nudge. And you can do all sorts of things like that. You can say to panels, please explain why you've made your appointment, all appointments, and what are you putting in place for staff from underrepresented groups who are good enough to be shortlisted to ensure they do better next time? What are you doing in your division to make sure that stretch opportunities, secondments, acting up, taking part in project teams, access to them is not by the tap on the shoulder. It's actually monitored, and we decide who goes in. Don't leave it to the line manager to take all the decisions.
The tap on the shoulder to someone who is just like me, and I feel so comfortable with them, and they must be brilliant because they think exactly the same way I do, and they love everything I say, So, hey, that's obviously the best person for this job, right? I want to build up one more thing that Roger mentioned, though, because you were talking about who is leading this, and it's often very junior HR people. And first of all, you have junior people. Secondly, you have people who are not in any way certified. They have not been through a certification process like you did, Sylvia, where they know really best practices and they know the pitfalls. And then also HR and DEI or EDI, have very different needs in some cases. And HR will often try to keep DEI small, that it has to do with training on unconscious bias, and it has to do with hiring enough of this, that, or the other thing. But really, EDI is so much more than that strategically. It has to do with supply chains, and it has to do with, as we said, making money, saving money, meeting organizational goals. And it has to do with growth into new markets, and it has to do with innovation, So you really want to see, ideally, the EDI or Chief Diversity Officer, whatever, should have a direct line of sight to the CEO, and should know the organizational goals and should have a seat at that table to have that conversation, not just be somebody who's reporting to HR, who's reporting to the people, head of people who reports to the whatever. You're not going to get substantive, fantastic results if you're just putting a very junior person in there who's just winging it and doing their best while having other responsibilities as well.
Well, that was a resounding yes. Senior leaders are accountable for the ongoing progress of the DEI strategy. I totally agree. And I can say that here at IC24, our DEI strategy started with our board, and it really makes the difference when our senior leaders are engaged. Well, if you've liked what you've heard and you want to watch out for future podcasts, then please subscribe to my channel. It's new. I'm just building it up. And I tell you what, I'm not necessarily looking for loads and loads of people just for the numbers. I want people to connect and to get involved and to have a voice and to like and share what they're hearing and to join the debate. That's really what I'm looking for. So if this is for you, please subscribe to the channel and watch out for our next podcast, because that's going to be a very interesting one. And it's going to be called Where Do You Belong? I know it's going to be explosive. And if you like what you've heard from Roger and Kathleen, you can contact them on LinkedIn or Twitter. You can contact them. I think the preference is LinkedIn. So please reach out to them and find out more about the amazing work that they're doing in their respective teams. And it would absolutely be remiss of me if I didn't also appreciate Marie Kafour from Destiny Events Professional, who produced this. She helped with this podcast. There would be a lot for me to do as well as host. And yes, you can see that with some of the clips, we encountered some technical issues, but do you know what? The content was so rich, I thought, let's go for it. So I hope that you've enjoyed it, and stay tuned next time. Watch out for some of the shorts that I'm going to be producing, as well as watching this full podcast. And if you have a topic that you'd love us to show on love us to table, on Zoud, or if you want to join us, well, why don't you reach out to me on LinkedIn too? Thank you so much for watching.